She boarded quietly, just like everyone else. But when a white man took her seat and refused to move, no one expected what happened next. This story will leave you stunned. For more powerful stories like this, subscribe to Simply Stories. She arrived at the airport alone, rolling a compact black suitcase behind her. Her posture was upright, calm, and assured. Dressed in a soft beige blazer and matching slacks, with her natural curls tucked neatly beneath a silk scarf, she exuded quiet confidence. She checked her phone briefly, then approached the gate desk with a polite nod. The gate agent scanned her ticket, smiled, and gestured her toward the jet bridge. She was among the first to board, thanks to her priority access. Though no one seemed to notice, inside the aircraft, the cabin was still half empty. The crew busied themselves with pre-boarding checks as she turned left into first class, heading toward seat 1A. She placed her bag gently in the overhead bin, pulled out a slim leather folio, and took her seat by the window. Her movements were smooth and practiced, as if this wasn't her first time in luxury, but also not something she flaunted. A soft chime echoed overhead as more passengers began to trickle in. She glanced outside the window, not realizing she was being watched. About 15 minutes later, a man entered first class, flanked by the sounds of laughter and casual conversation. He wore a navy suit that clung to him like armor and carried an expensive-looking briefcase. He paused mid-aisle, eyes narrowing as he locked onto her. Then, as if correcting an error in the system itself, he pointed at her. "Excuse me," he said. "Loudly, I think you're in my seat." She looked up, confused for only a second, before calmly lifting her boarding pass from the folio. "This is 1A, correct?" she asked, her tone polite, neutral. The man frowned. "Yes, it is." "Seat. There's been a mistake." A flight attendant nearby took notice and walked over. The man quickly turned to her and said, "There's a mix-up. She's in my seat." The attendant offered a professional smile. "May I see your boarding pass?" He handed it over confidently. The attendant glanced at the information, then at the woman's pass, which the woman had quietly handed her. She hesitated. Her smile faltered just a bit. "Well," the attendant began, shifting awkwardly, "you're both listed as seat 1A. It seems there may have been a duplicate assignment." The man scoffed. Obviously someone made a mistake. Didn't flinch. "It's on my ticket," she said simply, her tone firm now, but still without raising her voice. Another flight attendant was called in. They huddled near the galley for a brief conversation. Man crossed his arms, lips tight, with irritation, then leaned toward the woman as if she were the inconvenience. "Look, would you mind just moving to another seat so we can get this settled quickly?" She looked at him for a long second. No anger in her face, only something more cutting, restraint. Still, she said nothing. One of the flight attendants returned, this time with an apologetic tone. "Ma'am," she began softly, "we're terribly sorry for this. Would you be open to switching seats for now, just to avoid holding up the rest of the passengers? We'll sort everything once. We're airborne." The woman took a slow breath, glanced down at her ticket again, then nodded without protest. She stood, collected her folio, and walked past the man, who slipped into her seat as if it had always been his. There was a subtle shift in the cabin air. No one said anything out loud, but some passengers exchanged glances. A middle-aged woman in the third row leaned toward her husband and muttered, "I guess money doesn't buy manners." The man beside her chuckled under his breath. The woman made her way down the narrow aisle toward coach, still composed. She passed passengers cramming bags into overhead bins and settling children into their seats. No one offered her a sympathetic look. She found a seat near the back, wedged between a window and another tired traveler, and sank into it quietly. Her knees nearly touched the seat in front of her, but she didn't adjust. She simply opened her folio again, slid out a slim tablet, and began reading a financial report with total focus. Up front, the man stretched his legs in 1A, ordered a glass of sparkling water before the flight even pushed back, and chuckled smugly at something on his phone. The flight crew walked up and down, checking bags, nodding politely, and offering blankets. The door closed with a metallic thud, and the engines hummed to life. In the back of the plane, she closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Not to the announcements or the rustling passengers, but to herself. Not once had she raised her voice. Not once had she demanded recognition or insisted on what was already hers, and yet she knew that silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before revelation. 7 minutes. That's all it would take before the entire plane learned exactly who she was. The plane taxied slowly, its wheels humming softly beneath the cabin floor. Overhead, the cabin lights dimmed into a gentle glow, signaling that the flight was preparing for takeoff. The man in 1A leaned back with an exaggerated stretch, his expression smug. Reclining fully, he sipped from a glass of sparkling water and chuckled at something on his phone. He turned to the man beside him, initiating small talk about business, travel, expensive wines, and a vacation home in the South. He laughed loud enough for people around him to hear, relishing his comfort, the privilege of space, and the illusion of superiority. No one corrected him. No one even questioned how he'd ended up in that seat. Back in coach, the woman sat still, composed. Her shoulders were relaxed, her legs neatly crossed at the ankle despite the limited space. She opened her tablet and began reviewing charts, investment breakdowns, quarterly forecasts, and partnership proposals. Her eyes scanned the screen with focus, undistracted by the chatter around her. The world could shrink around her, compress into tight corners and narrower seats, but her presence remained expansive. A quiet force. She tapped once to highlight a note, made a small correction, and moved to the next slide. Her face was unreadable, but there was no sign of distress. Only a practiced calm as the plane approached the runway. A flight attendant made her way through the aisle, stopping briefly beside the woman. She offered a polite smile, more of a glance really, then continued toward the galley. But moments later, that same attendant leaned close to another crew member near the front and whispered something, eyes shifting back in the woman's direction. Their exchange was brief, but something about it felt hushed, deliberate. One of them pulled out a small tablet and tapped urgently, eyebrows furrowed suddenly. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, calm but unusual. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor discrepancy and have been asked to hold momentarily before takeoff. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll update you shortly. There was a pause in the cabin's rhythm. Conversations slowed, heads turned. The engines, which had been steadily powering up, eased back into a low idle. The plane didn't return to the gate. It stopped mid-taxi, a position planes rarely hold for long. Some passengers exchanged puzzled glances. A child asked their parent why the plane wasn't moving. The parent shrugged. No answers yet. In 1A, the man raised his eyebrows, annoyed. He tapped the flight attendant button once impatiently. When no one arrived right away, he muttered under his breath and turned back to his phone, scrolling with an exaggerated sigh. In the crew area, 2 attendants were now making quick, quiet phone calls. One of them stepped into the cockpit, closing the door behind her. Another moved briskly down the aisle with an iPad in hand, occasionally glancing toward the woman in coach. The tension among the crew had become noticeable. They were working hard to appear calm, but their movements had shifted, more exact, more rehearsed. A few seats ahead, a man in economy asked his neighbor what was going on. Probably some technical thing, the neighbor said, but neither looked convinced. A couple of rows behind the woman, a teenager had begun filming with his phone, panning around the cabin slowly. He didn't know what was happening, but something felt different. The woman, however, hadn't moved. She was still reviewing documents, her finger sliding gently over the screen. The numbers weren't distracting her from the moment, they were anchoring her. She adjusted her scarf slightly, then continued reading, seemingly unbothered by the delay. If anything, she appeared more composed than anyone else on board. The engines remained idle, the air conditioning whirred slightly louder. Now, in the silence, after several minutes, a subtle shift occurred. From outside the window, near the runway's edge, a white airport vehicle began approaching the aircraft slowly. Inside, 2 security personnel could be seen seated inside, speaking into radios. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Their arrival was expected. Inside the plane, the man in 1A sat up straighter, sensing something had changed. He glanced toward the front of the plane, then toward the galley, where a flight attendant now stood, waiting near the cockpit door. Her stance was still, her hands clasped in front of her. When the captain emerged a moment later, the murmur in the cabin grew louder. The woman in coach closed her tablet, placed it carefully back in her folio, and folded her hands on her lap. She looked ahead, eyes focused, still calm, still ready. She hadn't demanded anything, hadn't raised her voice. And yet the plane, the entire operation had slowed because of her. Something about that truth hovered in the air now, felt but unspoken. 7 minutes into the delay, everything had shifted. Not because she made it shift, but because who she was had finally caught up to where she sat. The moment the uniformed official stepped onto the plane, the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't a flight attendant, nor was he standard airport staff. He moved with quiet authority, his ID badge clipped neatly to his chest, his eyes scanning the cabin with purpose. Without pause, he walked directly to the man in seat 1A. Man, still reclining comfortably, raised an eyebrow in confusion, but didn't sit up. The official stopped just beside him and, in a voice low and calm, said, "Sir, I need to verify your boarding pass, please."
Ah.
The man blinked. "Excuse me?" he said, half laughing. "I'm good." Again, the request came still. Polite, still firm. "Your boarding pass, sir." Now annoyed, the man rolled his eyes and pulled his phone from the seat pocket. He scrolled, found the digital ticket, and handed the phone over with a smug grin. "You'll see it right there. Seat 1A. The official took one glance, frowned slightly, then tapped his earpiece, and turned toward a flight attendant who was standing a few feet away. He whispered something the rest of the cabin couldn't hear. The attendant's expression tightened. She nodded once, then walked briskly toward the back of the plane. A murmur began soft at first, then growing as a ripple through the rows. Passengers looked around, whispering quietly. Someone near the front leaned to their seatmate and whispered, "He's in the wrong seat." The man in 1A heard it. He straightened up suddenly, his confidence beginning to falter. "What's this about?" he asked, more defensive now. The official didn't answer. Instead, he looked down the aisle. Just as the attendant reappeared this time, walking toward the back, toward the woman. She sat still, her folio once again in her lap, her face calm. The attendant approached with a different tone now, more deliberate, almost reverent. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I'm very sorry for the earlier confusion. We'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class." The cabin went silent. It's utterly silent. The woman stood without a word. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look surprised. She simply nodded, picked up her belongings, and followed the attendant slowly up the aisle. The eyes of every passenger followed her. Some leaned into the aisle to see better. A child pressed their face against their window to catch a glimpse. There was something about the way she walked, not rushed, not boastful, just assured. Kind of composure that didn't need to prove itself as she reached the front. The man in 1A stood abruptly, his face flushed. "Listen, I didn't know someone must have switched," he stammered. But she didn't even glance at him. Just before she reached the seat, the cockpit door opened. The captain emerged. He was tall, composed, and wore his hat tucked under one arm. He stepped directly in front of her and extended a hand. "It's an honor to have you on board," he said, voice low, but clearly audible to the surrounding passengers. She shook his hand politely. "Thank you, Captain." The murmurs exploded. Someone near the rear gasped. A man pulled out his phone and quickly searched something. A second later, his eyes widened. "Oh my God," he whispered to the woman beside him. "That's her. She's the CEO of the holding company that owns this entire airline." Now people were whispering openly, trying not to stare, but failing. A few passengers looked stunned. One woman covered her mouth. Another man muttered, "No way," as he stared at the search results on his phone. The energy had turned. The same passengers who once glanced at her indifferently or dismissed her presence were now sitting straight, awkward, as if realizing they had underestimated someone important, someone powerful. The man who had taken her seat was now visibly sweating. I didn't know," he said again. eyes darting from her to the captain to the official still standing nearby. It was a mistake. She turned to him just once, finally acknowledging his presence. Her voice was soft, level, and cut through the tension like a blade. "Some seats," she said, "aren't taken. They're earned." The man said nothing. She took her seat in 1A, now cleared and waiting for her. A new glass of sparkling water had already been poured and placed on the armrest. The cabin crew busied themselves again, trying to return to routine, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Passengers exchanged glances. No one smirked this time. No one whispered sideways insults. Only silence and respect, the kind that didn't need to be demanded. The captain nodded to the official, who gave a final glance toward the man, now being politely but firmly asked to gather his belongings. He had been removed not for who he was, but for what he had done. The plane began to move again, slowly rolling toward the runway as if the delay had never happened. But everyone on board knew this flight would be remembered. Not because of turbulence or weather or time zones, but because a woman chose grace over confrontation, because she allowed the truth to arrive on its own time, knowing that it always does. The man's shoes tapped anxiously against the floor as the uniformed official stood beside him, blinking. After a tense moment of internal resistance, the man reached up, grabbed his briefcase from the overhead compartment, and stood. He tried to smile at the crew, at the passengers, even at her, but no one returned the gesture. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath, then walked off the plane in awkward silence, escorted by security. The sound of the front door sealing shut behind him was almost cinematic, like the closing note of a scene that needed no narration. The aircraft shuddered briefly as it pulled back into motion, and slowly the plane began taxiing again, this time without interruption. The passengers were quiet now, not from discomfort but from awareness. First class had never felt so still. There was no more idle chatter, no glasses clinking in self-satisfaction. No boastful discussions about hedge funds or real estate portfolios. Instead, there was an unspoken reverence, the kind that followed. People who didn't need to announce themselves. Even the flight attendants moved more precisely now, more aware of their audience, of the way a single moment had redefined the energy of an entire flight. In 1A, she sat in silence, legs crossed, hands resting gently over her folio. Her tablet had been stowed away. She wasn't working anymore. There was nothing to fix, nothing left to clarify. She simply watched the clouds drift by through the oval window, her posture composed, her energy unshaken. She hadn't needed to fight for the seat. Her silence had done all the talking, and now that silence echoed through the entire aircraft. A man seated nearby turned slightly toward her. He was older, with silver in his beard and a softness in his voice. "You handled that with grace," he said quietly. She glanced over and smiled, not smugly, not performatively. Just a soft smile that reached her eyes. "Class," she replied, "never needs to shout." He nodded in agreement, the kind of nod that spoke more than words could. In another row, a woman who had earlier cast dismissive glances now looked at her with quiet awe. Lips pressed together as if unsure how to apologize without speaking. Soon, a steward appeared beside her seat. He carried a chilled bottle of champagne in one hand and a single crystal flute in the other. With practiced elegance, he poured the glass and placed it on her tray table, bending slightly to whisper, "That man's face. It's all over social media." She blinked, but didn't react with surprise. Instead, she picked up the glass and raised it gently in acknowledgement, as if to say, "Of course it is." Unbeknownst to her earlier, when the conflict first began, one of the younger crew members had recognized her just barely. Her face had appeared once in a financial magazine, another time in a segment on international businesswomen shaping the future of global transport. At first, the attendant wasn't sure. But when the man began raising his voice and the woman simply stood her ground, something in the flight attendant's gut said, "People need to see this." She tilted her phone discreetly behind a service curtain and hit record. The video wasn't long. No dramatic shouting, no slurs. just a man insisting, a woman calmly holding her ground, and a crew initially failing to understand what was happening right in front of them by the time the plane was airborne again. Video had already been posted captioned simply, "Guess who just disrespected the CEO of the airline's parent company?" Within 20 minutes, it had spread like wildfire. Comments poured in. The calm is louder than the chaos. This is how power moves quietly. She didn't need to argue. Let the world do it for her. Major media outlets were already picking up the story. Headlines ranged from cheeky to powerful. CEO silently shuts down entitled passenger. First-class behavior, all the way power doesn't shout, it sits. A few networks reached out to her company for official statements. By the time the plane began its descent, the news cycle had already crowned her the embodiment of grace under pressure. As the cabin prepared for landing, the usual announcements felt almost irrelevant. Seatbacks upright, trays locked, nothing could reset the moment that had already taken flight hours ago. Her phone buzzed softly on the armrest. One notification, then another, then dozens. Emails from board members, partners, high-ranking executives all congratulating her. Some had watched the video. Others had already forwarded it across departments with subject lines like leadership redefined. And this is why we follow her. A senior advisor from her firm had written, "We've always known who you are. Now the world sees it too." Even members of her team, employees she'd mentored quietly over the years, had sent messages of support, respect, admiration. "You've shown us how strength isn't noise, it's presence." She scrolled through a few, then closed the device, placing it face down. She didn't need the applause. The landing gear extended, and the city lights began to form shapes. Beneath the clouds, the wheels touched the runway with a soft jolt, and the plane glided to a smooth stop. Inside, there was no rush to stand, no race for overhead bins. Passengers remained seated a little longer, eyes drifting toward her not with curiosity, but with respect. As the plane taxied to its gate, a final voice echoed not from the speakers, but within the quiet dignity of her presence. Asterisk respect isn't about appearance, it's about presence, grace, and truth. Sometimes power doesn't need to speak, it simply sits where it belongs.